Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Maureen McKay, and I'm a social worker currently serving with School Mental Health Ontario as an implementation coach and portfolio lead for youth suicide prevention. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us training. We're delighted. We can see that we've got about 378 that have already come into the training. We know that we're expecting some more. So we're going to get started just with our welcomes and let the other folks join us. It's an absolute pleasure this morning to introduce Teresa Kennedy and Kathy Short. Both are serving as co-directors for School Mental Health Ontario. I'm going to start with Teresa Kennedy.
Good morning and welcome to each of you this morning. We do welcome you warmly to be with us today during what continue to be some challenging times and months of demanding work that you have been working through so wonderfully to support the students across Ontario. So we just wanted to start with acknowledging your incredible efforts, knowing that we're all balancing personal and professional impacts of the pandemic. We're very grateful, as Maureen said, for the opportunity to have you participate today in this webinar as we continue to learn together in order to best support our students. And we continue to lead with hope and optimism as the intro song lyrics reminded us just a minute ago, someday things are going to get brighter. So I think that's a great way to start the day. So I will begin with a land acknowledgement, and then Kathy Short will bring a welcome as well. So today, as we gather from many places, please take a moment to pause and to reflect. Call to mind the traditional territories from which you are working today and the Indigenous people who have been stewards of this land for thousands of years. I am working from Kingston, Ontario, the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and I thank these nations for their care and stewardship over this shared land. Consider the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation in your community. Thank you. Kathy?
Morning, colleagues. Thank you so much for joining this important session on suicide risk assessment and management with youth. As you know, this is the second workshop on this topic, and it will begin today with a brief review of the first workshop, but will then provide a deeper focus in terms of clinical considerations to advance your practice in this area. Now, while it was always our plan to offer training in this area, COVID-19 has hastened and strengthened the urgency of this work. We know that in these times, many students are experiencing elevated mental health concerns. And so as school mental health professionals, we're called to be particularly equipped and to respond, especially for our role in suicide prevention. So like Teresa, I want to echo, thanks for all that you're doing to bring hope each and every day to our students. And we welcome you and our colleagues today. Maureen?
Thanks so much, Kathy and Teresa, for the very warm welcome. So just moving to the next slide, and actually, I'm going to stop sharing, Jen, and I'm going to just ask you if you can share. And there we go. So I've got a few bits of housekeeping. And Jen, if you can just go up to slide 4, that would be terrific. It's great. So we've got a terrific day planned for you, starting with a bit of housekeeping and then into some didactic training, followed by a panel discussion that is new for us. We ask that you put your questions into question and answer. There's another little mistake on my slide. I'm so sorry, everybody. Chat is disabled for you, but we can receive your questions in questions and answers. So today we've got a few pieces of housekeeping that we need you to take care of. And the first is that we need you to rename yourself on the Zoom webinar screen. So we need you to go up with your mouse, hover on your name. And when you do that, you will see the option for more. At that point, we'd like you to click more, and a box will pop up on your screen that will say rename. So we want your full name, first and last, and then the letters for your school board. So if you're, Toronto District School Board, TDSB. That really just helps us to maintain security within the webinar. So
Sorry,
thanks so much.
Yes? I'm just interrupting. My apologies to everyone in the webinar. They cannot rename themselves.
Oh, thanks, Louise.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry, that was my error. Sorry about that, everyone. You are not able to rename yourselves.
Okay, thanks so much, Louise, for helping us. We're all in a learning stance and Zoom is changing every day. So we need to just be flexible with that. So we welcome questions written into the question and answer in both English and French. So please feel free to send your questions our way. What we're going to do is collect the questions and the themes to the questions, and we'll have the panelists review them at break and weave them into answers in the panel session. We'll also, through the panel session, be collecting your questions, and we'll address the themes at the end of the session. If I could have the next slide, please, Jen. So we want to acknowledge that learning about suicide risk and management is different than any of the other learning we do as mental health professionals. We welcome you to take good care of yourself during this session, stepping away from the training if you need to. We're recording this training session, and you'll be able to come back to it at any time online to complete your learning if you do step away. If during this training you'd like to speak to a clinician in French or in English, please text my colleague, Lisa Dirksen, who's a team member for School Mental Health Ontario, and Lisa will connect you. You can actually text or call her, and you can see her number there on the screen, and she'll connect you with a mental health professional, and we can just kind of talk through what's going on for you in the moment as you're doing this learning. We're really happy to be able to do that and to think together about safety. Wanted to let you know that there'll be a break from 10 to 10:20. And very shortly, I'm going to be very happy to turn this training session over to Dr. Jen McTaggart. We are so grateful for Hamilton Health Sciences lending her to us to do this training today. We listened to you with the evaluations that for the part 1 training last spring, and you said, bring her back. We've got more learning to do in this area. So we're really excited to have Jen back with us today. We're also really excited about working together with my colleagues from School Mental Health Ontario. So Allison Potts, Deanna Swift, and Tracy Gross. And you had an opportunity to look at their bios. They come from diverse backgrounds with really terrific skill sets. And together we've all been thinking about the importance of clinical conversations that we have with our colleagues and how we all grow and learn when we have those conversations. So it is in the spirit of a clinical conversation that the panel will come together and we will we'll think and learn together about clinical questions. So without any further ado, I'm very happy to pass it over to Jen.
Thanks, Maureen. And thanks for having me back. I can't believe it's been 9 months since I was here talking to you guys about suicide risk assessment and management with youth. I don't think I thought that we'd be still in the middle of the global pandemic that we are 9 months later, but I think we were all a bit naive. And here we are. So thank you for having me back. I'm really excited to have these clinical conversations around suicide risk and management with youth. So as Kathy Short explained, we're just going to do a brief recap of level 1 training. Not going into that part in detail, but just kind of like hitting main points to ground us in the work that we're then going to talk about as we have our clinical conversations. So we talked in the last session about Joiner's intrapersonal theory of suicide that says that people die by suicide because they can and they want to. And although simplistic, it's very helpful to think about suicide this way because it lets us know what we need to assess. So we need to assess, does the person want to die by suicide, and can they? Are they capable of doing it? So that gets into the details of around our suicide risk assessment questions. We also learned, really importantly, the nature of suicide risk, what it is and what it isn't. So we know suicide risk is not static. It's not like someone is suicidal and therefore always suicidal. We know it's actually more fluid than that. It can come and go, sometimes quicker than one thinks it probably could come and go. It's not person dependent. It's not like this person can be suicidal and that person can't. It's actually probably more mood dependent. We hear youth talk all the time about saying, you know, I got sad or I got upset, and then these suicidal thoughts came about. It's not permanent. It's more variable over time, even short periods of time, which really lets us know it's not a simple a thing. It's a more complex thing that we really need to understand and appreciate the complexity of it. The OHA Suicide Risk Assessment Guide gave us a nice snapshot around the potentiating risk factors, so the long-term risk factors, as well as the more proximal warning signs around suicide risk. And knowing that one's risk increases, the more warning signs that you have, and that's that imminent suicide risk. So we knew there were five main components to imminent suicide risk: active suicidal ideation, which is the idea of I'm going to kill myself, versus I wish I was dead or I'd be better off dead. That the person has a plan, they have access to means of that plan, they've maybe taken steps towards the plan, and they have the intent to follow through on that plan. People, like we said in the last one, can have a variety of combinations of these five components. So someone might have a thought, I'm going to kill myself, and even have a plan, but they have no intention of following through on it. Or someone might have just active suicidal ideation, no plan, no intent. So we really need to make sure we're assessing each of those components in order to make an informed decision around risk. We also learned about protective factors. And protective factors don't trump risk factors. So if someone has ideation, plan, and intent, but yet has these protective factors, we don't say, well, they're okay. They kind of cancel each other out. They do not. But they give us hope and they allow us a target to intervene at. So, you know, does the person have hope that things can get better? Can they identify reasons for living? A fear of death is a good protective factor. A significant support system or a sense of connectedness, which in the last training, we identified this sense of connectedness as a huge protective factor. And one of the best ways that we can intervene when someone is suicidal is to increase their sense of connectedness. Positive school climate is a protective factor, religion, cultural ties, self-esteem, and good old-fashioned problem-solving skills and coping skills are really important. After we talked about the risk components, we talked about how do we manage suicidality. And I framed it in the sense of suicide is often seen as a solution to a problem for a youth. And so we want to help them see that the real problem is not that they're alive, it's that they're suffering in the way that their life is being currently lived. So then we can actually target the underlying suffering of their suicidality. And this means we truly need to hear their story, validate their pain and emotions, discuss what these thoughts will go away immediately, or that they'll be able to achieve their life worth living immediately. And that's not always the case. We can help them break their problem down into more manageable chunks and then begin to help problem solve. So ultimately, the goal is not to get someone to not kill themselves. That should not be the goal of our intervention. The goal should be help them find what their life worth living is. So our therapeutic stance is full of compassion, it's honest and candid, and it is a collaborative relationship among equals. So it's the two of us looking together and trying to figure out how do we get you the life that you want, in which suicide is not an option anymore. We talked about 5 steps that Miller and Emmanuel came up for managing suicidality. And I added the first one in the beginning, which was a focus on emotions. So making sure we're truly validating and understand what someone's emotional experience is. And then we generate hope. We problem solve the current situation, reduce high risk behaviors, which is incredibly important. We talked about how reducing access to means can be the best way to intervene when someone is suicidal, committing to a plan, and then troubleshooting the plan. We talked about what a safety plan should look like and the 6 pieces of a safety plan that were evidence-based. And this is based on Jobs' work, who is the creator of the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicide Protocol. So a safety plan should identify warning signs. So what is going on inside your body or going on for you when you notice these thoughts come out? So what are the early warning signs that we can say, I'm kind of heading down a path where I might want to start using some coping skills sooner than later? We provide them with we co-create some short-term problem solving skills and coping strategies. So what to do when they're having suicidal thoughts. The contact information for support people, both professional and personal, who they can call and reach out to if their suicidal thoughts keep happening or persist despite these coping skills that they might be trying. Any emergency contact numbers, local and national crisis lines. The plan for reducing access to lethal means. So I had mentioned that this is a really important intervention in suicide risk. And so how are they going to reduce their access to lethal means? Now we know that, you could buy a bottle of Tylenol at the dollar store. So we know that there's access to it, but we really want to reduce quick access, especially. So what's in their home, what's in their environment? How do we make that safe to reduce the access to means? And strategies for decreasing barriers to treatment and how to overcome them. We got into a discussion about when do we send to hospital. So where we landed was if they're unable or unwilling to engage in and follow a safety plan, they probably should go to hospital. Or if the adults in their life, the caregivers or other adults, are unable to remove access to means and or follow the safety plan. And we were having a discussion and even in our questions at the end of the last training about what might be the possible pros of sending someone to hospital. And one of that is time. We know that, just allowing some time. We talked about suicide risk being fluid. So even sometimes the time that it takes to send someone to hospital and to sit and emerge, while annoying and frustrating for so many families, sometimes is enough to let that crisis pass. So hospital might be able to offer a more focused risk assessment. They might be able to refer to any additional services that might be needed, and perhaps an admission if that's required. And so then we talked about, what would an admission look like? And we know there's huge variability across the province in terms of our inpatient units, their staffing models, what they offer, how long someone might stay, reasons for admission. So just a lot of variability across the province. And we know that sending to hospital does not mean that someone's going to be admitted. I know of many of my colleagues in the community who've had the frustrating experience of doing a risk assessment, sending their youth to hospital only to have that youth be discharged later that night. And while incredibly frustrating, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And sometimes we need to see sending to hospital as the intervention. And so, you did your work, you assessed as you needed to assess, they went to hospital, and that in that moment was the intervention. And then they're discharged home, because there are downsides to hospitalization that we always need to weigh when we're looking at hospitalization. So we know someone's risk for suicide increases significantly post-discharge. So we want to make sure that we're admitting youth that only need to be admitted. More importantly, probably, is that it removes youth from their typical environment. People don't get better in hospital usually. And I think this is a bit of a mind shift for mental health, that when you remove someone from the typical environment, there's this like, this sort of relaxation around, or this like breath of relief that they no longer have the pressures that maybe were part of the contributing factors to their hospitalization. But it's a false reality. You might be able to learn skills, but you can't really practice them in hospital because you don't have the same stressors that you have at home. So it really is like a brief removal from everyday life, but kids get better in their lives. So needing to make sure we're not keeping kids in hospital so long that they maybe learn negative behaviors from their peers, or worse, they begin to identify as unwell. Jobs calls that the suicide identity. He calls it the siren song of suicide. So that fear that becomes part of their identity, that I am someone who is suicidal, or I am someone who has such significant mental health struggles. And that's a hard thing to necessarily shift from. So when we're assessing risk, this constant balance of making sure we're not underestimating someone's suicide risk and not overestimating someone's suicide risk. And knowing that when our own fear increases, we're more likely to overestimate suicide risk. And that's when we try to control our client, which is, for those of us who work with youth, we know that that's a huge, not very well received. And that's when clients try to push back. So really, we need to let our risk determination come from data and a good risk assessment rather than from fear. And we're going to talk about this as we get into the clinical risk decision-making tool that we are going to present to you guys today. So in summary, I have it kind of broken down into what you do and how you do it. So when you're doing suicide risk assessments, you need to be aware of the risk factors, the warning signs, and the protective factors. You need to ask specifically about suicide. No more of this dancing around it. We're asking about, have you had thoughts of killing yourself? Continually fostering hope and commitment to life. It's not an assessment and then a safety plan. You're weaving in safety planning throughout your assessment, because that's part of your assessment. Is this person actually engaged in the safety planning? Are they able to identify strategies in order to keep themselves safe? All the while increasing problem-solving skills, their sense of belonging and connectedness, and their tolerance of psychological pain. So being able to tolerate that distress and know how to respond in that moment. So using good clinical judgment as well as other sources of information about the person. So being able to get some collateral information, balancing confidentiality and safety, always knowing safety trumps confidentiality, but be mindful of respecting someone's confidentiality. Creating that safety plan with all the evidence-based components, making sure the person is appropriately monitored, and documenting well. I'm trying to switch pages. How you do it. So how you do the risk assessment is with genuine curiosity, concern, and a calm acceptance of the client's emotional and cognitive states. So, you're managing your own fears in those moments so that you can be fully present with the youth, being compassionate and empathetic, honest, open, frank, and candid, really trying to understand the causes for their suffering, being collaborative rather than interrogative, pretty sure that's a word, validating the client's pain and suffering, and taking a firm stance against suicide. So it's sort of walking that balance. How do I completely try to understand what you're experiencing and maintain hope and problem solving for how things could be better, how they could get the life that they want. So the current state of the world, I talked to you guys 9 months ago, and we've been in the global pandemic for 11 months. So where are we now? So in the Canadian context, when we wrote the slides, there's no clear data yet that youth suicide rates are increasing. We actually read last night that there is some data to suggest that suicide rates across Canada are down 16.8%, I believe, across the country on a national level than 2019. So there's actually been a decrease in suicide rates nationally. I think there's about 5 provinces reporting so far, and in each of those provinces, it's also a decrease. So there's not data to suggest at this point that suicide rates are for youth increasing. I know that there's been an increase in calls to Kids Help Phone, and that very well could be due to fears about going to hospital. Maybe those would have been youth who would have gone to the hospital in the beginning, or that they're not connecting with people in their schools who maybe they would have talked to and been able to be coached by. There's possible financial pressures that families are experiencing, and all of us are experiencing this prolonged isolation. For the youth, they've been doing a lot of virtual learning, which for some youth has been great and for others has been awful. A lot of the youth that I talk to are really mourning the loss of these normal, typical experiences, not being able to get their driver's license when they thought they would, not having grad, these rites of passage that kids look forward to, that we all look forward to in our life, and not being able to have those experiences as they thought they would. And many of the youth that I'm talking to are talking about this reduced sense of meaning or purpose. They're like, what's the point? What am I doing in life? They don't feel productive. They don't feel as though they have that anchor, that grounding in meaning or purpose that allows them to get that sense of pride. In our hospital here in Hamilton, where I work, but I've also heard it across the country, our volumes were initially, when I spoke to you in May, our volumes were low. Not many people were coming to hospital. Our census was low. And then midsummer till now, the volumes have been higher. We've had quite a large influx of presentations to hospital. And many of these youth are complex psychosocial presentations. So much going on for these youth and their families. And we've definitely seen an increase in substance use. So that's sort of the context with which I've been experiencing youth suicide in the last 11 months.